Our next question is for Kevin. While working on your research paper at Harvard University, what are the acute and chronic effects that microaggressions and racism have on individuals in the Black community? Do you find these adverse effects being recognized by the privileged majority in America?
Right. So to the first part of your question, like I said earlier, my research looks at trauma and how it affects the brain. And our research is showing that um, when you are exposed to subtle like instances of racism, your friends who make those jokes that are not so funny and you're not quite sure how to react, those instances seem to be more harmful to your brain than the overt instances of racism, maybe like being called a racial slur, because your brain has to, you're sitting in that moment trying to think of, one, what's my response? Two, am I actually experiencing like racism in this moment, or is this person just being ignorant? You have all these, you're dedicating all these resources to trying to figure out what's happening in this situation and how to proceed. And by the time your brain does all of that, your brain has to do that consistently, like as a Black person, as you move about life every single day of your life. You never know if you go out and into your job or school, and you don't know if you're going to see racism. You have to always anticipate it. So the resources you dedicate to that anticipation actually affect the neural pathways in your brain and make it such that you just see it everywhere you go, and you just feel that stress. It's called racial based traumatic stress. You just experience that stress as you move about life. And we see this in health outcomes. I remember growing up, and like my parents would always be like, Black people are more likely to have like high blood pressure, but no one ever talks about why it is that Black people are more likely to have high blood pressure. It's not because, oh, you're Black and therefore you're more likely to have these diseases, you're more likely to have higher instances of infant mortality. It's because, as Kyle said, the system, it's not broken, it's working as it should. It's white supremacist at its finest, and it works to dehumanize you, and it works to harm you such that you can't even live your life properly. You can't go and get a degree and feel like, oh, I'm going to be able to uplift myself, because you're going to go to that workplace and experience some type of discrimination, and you're going to have to deal with that like in your career. You're going to have to deal with that in your education. And by the time you deal with all of that, you're just so tired, you're so worn out that of course you'd have high blood pressure. Of course you'd see higher rates of infant mortality. Of course you'd see higher rates of adult mortality and morbidity. We have to think about how we as a society want Black people to be treated. And it's not just like a healthcare thing. It's not just a neurological thing. It affects everything from criminal justice to housing discrimination. It all ties together, and they all work to oppress and suppress Black individuality and Black economic power and Black upliftment. Oh, and I guess to the second part of your question, looking at whether these adverse effects are being recognized with the privilege. I mean, I think like Shayla said, right now we're seeing a great reckoning. That being said, I think to sympathize with Black people and their suffering is not the same as to empathize with their suffering. No, I mean, these are people who have for centuries have benefited from our oppression, have benefited from the looting of Black people. So for them in 2020 to finally say, oh, I see you, I hear you, I'm with you, it feels like it's a little too late, and that if we actually want the change that we want to see, we have to move beyond incremental change. We have to move beyond protests and start to think about what radical change will look like, what revolution will look like in this country.
Thank you, Kevin. That was an amazing response. Does anyone else have any other input they'd like to give?
Okay, we will move along to our next question, but I do have to say that I appreciate you emphasizing that. And it's not just something that someone says to you instantly and then it goes away. When we're talking about microaggressions or just straight acts of racism, this is something that lingers on and you think about. And then when you're having to ponder whether did someone actually say that to me? Were they actually being racist? That's another aspect of it. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate you talking about the struggles that Black women face as well, because that is just also important. And we know we are not always strong, and Black women are facing higher rates of maternal mortality.